Well, hello to everyone, and welcome to the December 3rd, 2020 speaker program for the World Affairs Council of Central Illinois. This is the fourth program for our current business year, which runs from July 2020 through June 2021. My name is Bruce Strom, and I am the board president for the current business year. I know that some of you are not familiar with the World Affairs Council of Central Illinois, so I would like to review some things about who we are. The World Affairs Council of Central Illinois is a chapter of a national organization called the World Affairs Council of America. Our chapter was established in 1988. I know that the mission of the World Affairs Council of Central Illinois is to provide residents in Central Illinois communities information about foreign policy issues and international relations, and to provide a forum for discussing these things. Its purpose also includes promoting and fostering international understanding of global issues. The World Affairs Council of Central Illinois receives support from NPR Illinois, which provides publicity for our programs. This provides residents in the area with information regarding our programs, including the topic, the speaker, the date and time, and the location for each presentation. In addition, we receive support from the University of Illinois at Springfield, from Lincoln Land Community College, and from Southern Illinois University School of Medicine. Information about the World Affairs Council of Central Illinois and the programs that are scheduled can be found on our website at mywacky.org or on our Facebook page. Recordings of past programs can be seen on our website and on our Facebook page. We have automatically muted the microphone for each of you as you join tonight's Zoom program. For the duration of the speaker's presentation, we ask that everyone please keep your microphone muted. After the speaker has finished her presentation, there will be a question and answer period, and we will explain the process for asking questions at that time. And now I would like to introduce our speaker. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Megan Stiles. Dr. Stiles is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Environmental Studies at the University of Illinois, Springfield. Dr. Stiles is a cultural anthropologist. Her research has focused on sustainable agricultural development, rural livelihoods, and conservation issues in the United States and in East Africa. Since 2004, she has conducted research near Lake Naivasha, where 70% of the flowers in Kenya are grown. Dr. Stiles will describe what life is like for the workers on Kenyan farms and what attempts have been made to regulate this lucrative and controversial industry. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Megan Stiles.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. It's lovely to see some familiar faces on the cameras here, some people that I've met recently and at least one student, so that's really exciting. I've got some slides that I'm going to share here. Let's see. So Bruce, would you mind giving me a thumbs up if you can see my slides?
Yes, we can see them, Megan.
Okay, thank you, Jolene. I appreciate it. All right, well, the title of my talk tonight is Roses from Kenya, Labor, Environment, and the Global Trade in Cut Flowers, which also happens to be the title of my book, which was published by the University of Washington Press in December 2019. So if you'd like to learn more about some of the things that I talk about tonight, it's all covered in great detail in my book. And I'd be delighted to talk about some of the material that is in the book that I might not be able to cover tonight during the question and answer session as well. So if we were live in person, I would start by asking you this question just to quiz your prior knowledge. What nations are the world's top exporters of cut flowers? And I'm sure that many of you would immediately give me the right answers since you're all very interested in world affairs. But since we're not live and it's a little bit harder to have that kind of question and answer interaction with you all, I'll go ahead and show you the answers now. So in terms of the percentage of global exports, the Netherlands really dominates the market, and they have since the tulip craze. The reason that they're so dominant is that they actually import flowers from other nations and then are a central hub for trade for that network for those flowers moving out from elsewhere. But 65% of the flowers that we would purchase here in the United States are grown in Colombia or Ecuador. But if we were living in the European Union or the UK, 35% of the cut flowers that we might buy there are actually grown in Kenya. So Kenya is the fourth largest exporter of cut flowers in terms of the percentage of global exports. And the fifth, until recently, was actually Belgium, but the Ethiopian flower industry, which is nascent, is beginning to grow, and it's actually in the fifth place now. So Kenya is not the only African nation that exports flowers, but it's one of the oldest and one of the most successful. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of what the global trade in flowers looks like globally, there are really two separate supply chains. One that supplies flowers to the United States. So most of the flowers the roses specifically that we might grow here in the US are probably grown in Colombia and Ecuador. And then they actually come to us through Miami through a wholesale market. So by the time they end up in the florist or they end up in the grocery store, it's very difficult to tell where those flowers came from. The place of origin is really obscured by that particular supply chain. The supply chain that reaches Europe usually comes from Kenya, from East Africa, also from Israel, and they go directly to supermarkets and to florists in Europe, or they go through the Dutch auction. And it's a lot more common to find place of origin labels on those flowers. People are a little bit more cognizant, not only of where their flowers are grown, but also where their different foodstuffs are grown. And a lot of that is because of the European reaction to mad cow disease in the 1990s. They became very concerned about the fact that the place of origin of a lot of the foods that they were consuming had been obscured. And so after mad cow disease, there was a lot of legislation that was passed in the UK and in the EU to make sure that fresh products that were being imported from abroad were labeled in terms of the place of origin, so people would have a better idea of where those foods were coming from. So again, most of these flowers that are grown in Kenya are going to the EU and to the UK, and it's a major percentage of that market share. They grow 35%. And so when I was beginning my research about 20 years ago now, which is hard to believe, when I was first starting graduate school, I was very interested in the Kenyan rose industry, in part because it gets a lot of press. So especially around Valentine's Day, there are often a lot of articles in the European press and in the press in the UK. And there are really kind of two divergent ways that the flower industry is depicted. In one version of the story, it's sort of a development miracle. So unlike traditional commodities like tea and coffee, which are sort of up and down in terms of their value, and there are lots of other nations at this point that also produce those crops, those traditional commodity crops. Roses and other fresh vegetables like green beans, starting in the 1990s, started to capture a lot more foreign exchange for Kenya. So roses are a significant source of foreign exchange, and they're considered really central to the Kenyan economy, especially that agricultural export economy. And part of the reason that the industry is also viewed as a development success is that the vast majority of the workers who provide the labor for this industry are women. So 65 to 70% of the workers who pick flowers and pack flowers in the pack houses are women. So not only is it an incredibly important source of foreign exchange, it's also a very important source of jobs for women who are restricted from work in other parts of the Kenyan economy. It's not quite as typical to see them in these wage labor positions. So again, I told you before that most of these flowers that are grown in Kenya are destined for one of two markets. They either, the growers either have direct supply contracts with supermarkets, and if they have a direct supply contract, they provide the entire bouquet to that supermarket. So they would grow or contract with outgrowers to get all of the different flowers that would be in a given bouquet that a supermarket would want to buy. And when the workers are standing on the line packing those flowers, they actually have a little book with an image of what the bouquet should look like, what flowers it should include. And they pull all of those flowers together. They wrap them with flower food. They wrap them in cellophane, they put the sticker on them, the price sticker on them, and they put them in the box. And all the supermarket needs to do is take those out of the box and put them into the vase in the display. The rest of these flowers, actually the flowers that are higher value varieties, go to the Dutch auction. And so the Dutch auction mainly supplies wholesalers and florists. So those more expensive, higher quality varieties tend to go through the Dutch auction. And this, if you've never been to the Dutch flower auction, it's a pretty incredible thing. Just outside of Amsterdam in Aalsmeer is I think it's still the world's largest indoor commercial complex. And every morning between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m., millions and millions of flowers from all over the world are sold through the Dutch auction system. So this is what it looks like in that top left-hand corner. These lots of flowers come underneath the clock. You can see where it was produced. You can see how much is available. The price begins to fall gradually. And then the buyers who are sitting in these stadium style seats actually bid on those flowers and buy them in bulk until they're all gone. And then another product shows on the screen. So all of this happens really quickly. The flowers that are sold in Europe and the UK that are grown in Kenya, they are, from the time that they are cut in the greenhouse in Kenya to the time that they reach the grocery store shelves, is only about 48 hours. So this is all made possible by air transport, by cooling technologies, and by a really kind of efficient and incredible commercial system that brings together these growers in Kenya to these markets on the other side of the world. So I told you that one of the stories about Kenyan flower production is sort of how it's a development miracle and how it employs all these people. There's another side of the story that kind of focuses on the profound ethical challenges that are associated with floriculture. So when I was developing my research project in the very beginning, I was really intrigued by the contrast between these newspaper articles that describe this as something wonderful, and then another set of articles that literally referred to it in very dramatic terms as something that was evil, right? So stories about poor labor conditions within the industry, sexual harassment of these women who are seeking jobs on these farms, and then another set of stories that focused on the environmental impacts of the industry. And so when I was first starting my graduate program, I was in an environmental anthropology program, and I was interested in a research topic that would allow me to explore not only the working conditions in this industry, but also how people were dealing with and seeking to regulate some of the environmental problems that were arising from this industry as well. So just to familiarize ourselves with where these flowers are grown. So this is a map of Kenya, and I did my research in a place called Lake Naivasha, which is at the tip of this big red arrow here. And Lake Naivasha is situated in the Rift Valley in Kenya, and it's an incredibly important freshwater resource because most of the other lakes that are in the Rift Valley are saline. They don't have an outlet, and they don't serve as a reservoir for potable water. So this is a really important freshwater resource. It's home to many different communities of people who lay claim to this space and who rely on the land near this lake and the water that is in this lake. But it's valuable also for flower production because it's very close to Nairobi. It's only about an hour and a half drive from Nairobi, so it's very easy to get the flowers to the airport. And the lake itself provides a source of irrigation water. Flowers are very water intensive, so you need a reliable source of irrigation water. Flowers are grown elsewhere in Kenya. So everywhere that you see a little green spot on this map is a site of flower production. In most of these other places, they're not using surface water, they're using borehole water, so groundwater to grow these flowers. And Naivasha was one of the first places where the floral industry in Kenya really exploded. And because of its proximity to Nairobi, 70% of the flowers that are grown in Kenya are still grown in this particular location, even though it has spread to other locations. So Naivasha is also very interested because it has a very complex and politicized history. So many of you might be familiar with the Maasai, which is one of Kenyan's 42 ethnic groups. The Maasai are traditionally pastoralists, and Lake Naivasha was known as a dry season pasture for the Maasai. So they inhabited a large territory. They would bring their cattle here to graze seasonally and to use that lake as a water source as well. So traditionally, this was known as Maasai land. Because they were pastoralists, they didn't necessarily settle intensively in the lake basin. This was part of a seasonal round in terms of their cattle migration, but this is traditionally recognized as their territory. So the Maasai were displaced in 1904 through a treaty with the Kenya's colonial occupiers, the British. So Kenya was a British colony, only gained independence in 1963. And Naivasha is part of the White Highlands. So this is part of the area in Kenya that was less prone to malaria, where it was easier for white settlers to settle. Again, it's also very close to Nairobi. And it wasn't necessarily good for intensive agriculture without all of these irrigation technologies that would develop later on, but it was really good for dairy cattle production and other sorts of sort of extensive agriculture and animal keeping, livestock keeping. So white settlers settled in the area near Naivasha. Many of these white Kenyans who are now third or fourth generation white Kenyans are still living in that area. So there's this history of the displacement of the pastoralists who were traditionally occupying that area, of white settlement. And then after Kenya gained independence in 1963, there were many Kenyans from other ethnic groups that came to settle here to access the resources available around this lake. Naivasha is also a really important ecological space. So it is recognized as a Ramsar site, which means that it's a wetland of international importance. And it's a place where people come from all over the world to bird watch. So Naivasha is an important place on the migratory routes of many birds that move from north to south seasonally. And so people will come here to go on safari and to get a lifer, to see a bird that they wouldn't be able to see anywhere else. It's also home to hippos. This is an image of the fish eagle and lots of the other sort of Kenyan wildlife that we associate with that tourism industry in Kenya. So in addition to being a site of intensive rose production, it's also a site of both domestic and international tourism. People come here to stay in fairly high-end hotels to view wildlife and to spend some time on vacation. It's typically one of the first places that you might stop if you go on safari in Kenya, because it is so close to Nairobi that they can pick you up at the airport, and instead of staying in Nairobi overnight, they'll bring people to stay in Naivasha overnight for their first stop before they head on to other more well-known national parks. So this is an image from the north side of the lake, which is less developed. And it gives you a sense of what Lake Naivasha might have looked like into the 1970s. Floriculture is really going to take off there. It'll be nascent in the early 1980s, and it'll really explode in the 1990s, and it's expanded even more into today. But until the 1970s, this is really what Lake Naivasha looked like. You can see that there's a really rich riparian zone, good vegetation papyrus that helps protect the lake from runoff, and that helps this be a healthy ecosystem, a good set of wildlife, biodiversity, etc. And this is what much of the lakeshore looks like today with intensive rose production. So you can see that this is a pretty dramatic contrast. So I'll just highlight that again. This is what the lake looked like into the 1970s, and then this is what it looks like today. So floriculture has really become the dominant land use right around the lake edge. And remember, they're building these farms fairly close to the lake edge because they're really heavily dependent on irrigation water drawn from the lake. This is intensive rose production, and it's done in greenhouses. So if you're a pastoralist that wants to bring your cattle here to graze or to water, this isn't really a land use that can be done alongside pastoralism. Once you build these greenhouses, you've really enclosed that space and locked it off from other possible land uses. So these greenhouses are really enormous in size. They go on for miles along the lakeshore. They're pretty impressive. And again, those roses are grown inside these greenhouse complexes. The largest Kenyan flower farm is 265 hectares, which, as I've noted here, is equivalent to 495 football fields. So these are really big, really impressive farms. And so in addition to the development that comes with the construction of these greenhouses themselves and the growing of flowers, this lucrative industry has also attracted an incredible number of people to Naivasha. So since the 1990s, Naivasha's population has gone from about 30,000 to about 300,000 people. And there's very little sort of planned urban development as part of this. So as the population has exploded, we've seen the development of lots of shantytown settlements where workers are living in fairly poor housing. There's no formal sewage treatment plant, and very few people live with access to running water. So all of the problems that come with that kind of rapid urban development are a serious concern here. And when it comes to the environmental impacts of the industry, they've done a good job over time with limiting the runoff from pesticides and herbicides that are used on the farm. They're pretty good at controlling those and using zero runoff practices and drip irrigation. But when it comes to all of the things that come from rapid unplanned development, so soil pollution from hillsides that have been stripped of their vegetation and all of that soil runs into the lake, sewage, etc., all of those things are really more of an itself. Look at in the image here of those are greenhouse, open air rootstock production. That anything that's grown open air is usually just rootstock that they then are able to graft the different varieties of flowers onto. But all of the flowers that are sold, that are grown to be sold, are grown under greenhouses. I'm getting a message that my internet connection is unstable. So if I disappear, I will come back. I think it's stabilized. Okay. So in the upper part of the image, that's those fields. And what you see in the bottom part of the image is all those smaller buildings. Those are all those unplanned settlements. So those are shantytown settlements where workers are living. It's both workers and people that are hoping to find jobs within this industry. And so I've been working in Naivasha now since 2004. And I've had kind of the same set of research questions that I've gradually been sort of researching and thinking about since then. So I'm interested, in course, in what people who are living in Naivasha, the people who are really dependent on this landscape, view as the negative and positive effects of floriculture. And if and when their viewpoints really vary, if some people think this is great, other people think this is ultimately very harmful, why is that the case? Sort of how are they dependent on this landscape and why do their viewpoints vary? I'm also very interested in how floriculture is regulated and how these regulations work, how they're contested, and how they evolve over time in response to new threats. So who takes part in devising and enforcing these regulations? And the opposite of that as well, who is left out of those processes? And then as a broader question that has always animated my research, I'm interested in what can be done to make floriculture work better for Kenya or for other places where flowers are grown. What can we do to make this industry more ecologically and socially just? And as a separate, since this is the World Affairs Council, I should also say that as a theoretical project within anthropology, I'm also really interested in what places like Naivasha and industries like rose farming can tell us about Kenya's place within the global economy. How is Kenya positioned within global flows of both money and resources, et cetera, and what can we hope for or what can we sort of predict might happen in the future with Kenyan political and economic development? So my research methods, as Bruce said, I'm a cultural anthropologist, so I mainly do qualitative research. So the bulk of my research and the times that I have gone to work in Kenya, I've lived in Kenya, and I've done interviews and participant observation with a whole slew of stakeholders whose lives are dependent not only on floriculture, but on the landscape surrounding Lake Naivasha. So people whose livelihoods might be in conflict in one way or another with this rose industry that is exploding here. I also do archival research. So what you're looking at here is a picture of the Kenyan National Archives in downtown Nairobi. I've been able to pull all of the both colonial and post-colonial era files on the history of Naivasha to think about what this place was like in the past and how it was governed in the past, and also what were the environmental concerns that people had in other historical moments before floriculture really exploded here. And the funny picture of the two towers in the bottom right is the headquarters of the Nation newspaper, one of Kenya's two largest newspapers. You can actually access that, and I have files going back until the early 1960s of every newspaper article that has been published on the Kenyan flower industry, which are really a rich trove of not only thinking about the history of this industry, but how people have thought about floriculture, what their hopes and dreams and aspirations were that they attached to this. And these are just a few of these articles to give you an idea that as early as the 1970s, people were already talking about all of the issues and controversies that still surround the industry today. Labor conditions with promises to improve them, concerns about where the money that comes in for floriculture is going. Is it actually being invested in Kenya, or is it being siphoned off by foreign stakeholders, et cetera? All of the issues that kind of animate the industry and cause controversy today have been with it since the beginning, and that those newspaper articles help me get that historical perspective. As an anthropologist, I'm always interested in sort of using other methods to kind of ground truth what people tell me about their experiences and their memories of a space. And so aerial photos and satellite images can help me see some of the things that people describe to me in terms of patterns of growth or development or environmental concern. So I've also used satellite images to kind of piece that together. And what you see in these images is that abstraction of water from the lake has caused the lake level to drop dramatically. Some of this is also due to kind of climatic fluctuations in Kenya, but there is an enormous amount of the water in this lake that is missing because it's being extracted and used to water these flowers. So some people actually describe floriculture as an out of basin transfer, taking this water, using it to grow flowers, and then that water as a resource is essentially shipped overseas away from a place where it's really needed, like this dry space in Kenya. So you can also see the white in these images is the greenhouse. You can also see that expanding all the way around the lake. If I had a picture from 2020, you'd now see those white greenhouses going all the way around the lake edge. So this really is developing very quickly. So to start to answer some of these questions for you, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about this in our question and answer session. So as a result of my research, I found that people had really divergent opinions and experiences of floriculture, which really isn't that surprising. But was really interesting is that almost everyone, even people who really owned these farms and who made a living in floriculture, were aware of the exploitative aspects of the industry. So no one was sort of complacent about the fact that people were being paid fairly low wages to grow a product that was being shipped overseas that couldn't be used locally, et cetera. Everyone was aware and awake to that possibility and was thinking about what we could do to make this more socially and environmentally just. And despite these concerns, I was really surprised and have remained perennially surprised that viewpoints overall were more positive than I expected, especially among middle-class Kenyan professionals. So many of the articles that I had read in the BBC News, et cetera, that were sort of exposés about the evils of the flower industry tended to focus on the experiences of the lowest paid wage laborers in the industry. And those women and men make up an incredible portion of the workforce. Their lives are hard. And the things that they can gain from this are sometimes slippery. I'll show you an image in a second that kind of suggests how they think about that. However, they really felt like Naivasha and the flower industry were one of the only places that they could go in Kenya to try to build a foundation and earn the capital that they needed to do whatever else it was that they wanted in life, whether it was to buy land or start a business, etc. So even the low-wage laborers really had some pretty profound aspirations that were attached to their labor in this industry, even knowing that it was very problematic. And then those articles that I had read also tended to leave out the perspectives of these middle-class Kenyan professionals. So a very large number of workers who had actually trained to work in this industry, who had college degrees or secondary degrees and certificates focused on floriculture, that actually had very successful lives within this industry. And then the other thing that was very interesting, I told you that I had this question about how Naivasha and how the flower industry can teach us about Kenya's role in a global economy and its space within global flows. People had an idea that there was something special about Naivasha, that Naivasha was what many people called a nerve center. And what they meant by that is that they weren't just coming here to work in floriculture. They were coming here because there were all of these other forms of transnational interconnectedness and opportunity that floriculture anchored in this particular place in Kenya, and it made it special, right? So the nonprofits that had come to try to be involved in regulating floriculture, people could come to Naivasha and find jobs with those non-governmental organizations, or they could work in floriculture and travel and end up working on a farm in Ethiopia or a sister farm in Colombia or Ecuador. So this was a place where people thought that global flows were really plugged into, and they could come here and hope to access those and thereby influence the course of Kenyan development. It was seen as a very powerful place within Kenya, even though it was this kind of exploitative industry. There was so much more going on. So just a couple of images to give you an idea of how people articulated these things to me. So again, the low-wage laborers, their lives were very difficult. They made about $2.50 a day, which sounds horrific to us, but is obviously more than most people living in rural Kenya are able to take in terms of a wage. And one of the reasons that they really sought out jobs in floriculture specifically is that they weren't just earning their daily wage, they were also able to borrow against their salaries. So all of the farms had savings and credits unions so that they could take out loans against their salaries. And then they gradually paid those loans off over a long time of working in the industry. Hopefully, many of them ended up being stuck there for longer than they intended, trying to pay these loans off. But with the loans, they did things like start businesses, buy land, pay school fees for their children, etc. And so they described it in the way that's articulated here, that this was a place of sacrifice, that life here was full of challenges, but it was unlike other places in Kenya where there weren't any opportunities to earn that capital, and that they could come here and have a steady flow of income to keep up their objectives. You have to come to Naivasha to build a foundation, was as it was described to me. And then again, there were all of these middle-class Kenyans who were working in all of these other professions and positions within the industry that we often forget about. There were people that were the quality managers, people who were the technicians, the doctors in the infirmaries, etc. And so they took very seriously the idea that they were performing against Kenyan stereotypes, that they were showing the world through their labor in floriculture that Kenyans had the capacity to run a successful industry, to regulate a successful industry. And this was a quote that kind of illustrated that particular perspective, that they tell us that Africa is not working, but we can say it is working, and we can demonstrate that through our labor, that we are able to manage these resources, that we are able to have this successful industry, etc. And then in a broader sense, I also, as part of my research, interviewed people that were agents of the Kenyan state, so government officials, elected officials, etc. And they were very excited about floriculture because of its potential to attract foreign investment to Kenya, right? So floriculture was one of the kind of pillars of this broader Kenyan strategy of moving beyond international aid to attract foreign direct investment into these businesses, whether it was floriculture or geothermal power, which is also an important industry in Kenya, or some of these other kind of lucrative Kenyan industries that they are really trying to develop through foreign direct investment. And so to answer that sort of answered the question of how people view the positives and the negatives and what this tells us about Kenya's role in a global economy. To get to another one of my questions, how is this industry regulated and how well do these regulatory strategies work? So one of the reasons that I was really interested in floriculture is that these flowers cross-cut incredible categories of human difference. They go from a place that is more or less impoverished to a place that is much more centrally located, where people are much wealthier, etc. And how does anybody regulate an industry like this? And so, as is the case with many agricultural industries, a lot of what we see in the Kenyan flower industry is actually self-regulation through codes of ethics. So there was a backlash against this industry at the consumer end in the early 2000s. There were boycotts against Kenyan flowers because of some of these newspaper articles and documentaries that played on the television that talked about some of these challenging labor conditions and environmental conditions. And as a result of that, the auction houses that buy these flowers, the supermarkets that buy these flowers, they now have established these codes of ethics. And what those say is that if you want to provide flowers in our supply chain, you have to sign on to certain specifications in terms of how you're going to treat your workers, what you're going to do with the environmental conditions on your farm, etc. And so in order to get their flowers to markets, the Kenyan flower farms have to sign on to these codes of ethics with their retailers. And then the farms are audited multiple times a year by retailers and auction houses. So usually 4 to 5 times a year they come. They don't always let them know that they're coming, to try to make sure that they can catch them off guard and see whether or not they're really abiding by these codes. And what farm managers would tell me is that they felt like this was working in a sense. It gave them really good control over on-farm spaces. One manager said to me, I am confident that everything is above board, that our workers are treated well, that we're not releasing any chemical pollution to the lake, but that everything on farm is above board, but they really had no control of what happens off farm. So all of those spaces where workers are living off farm in these shantytown housing settlements, et cetera, anything that's happening off farm that is sort of a knock-on effect of the uncontrolled forms of development that come with floriculture, those are not something that is regulated by these codes of ethics. It's outside of that regulatory space. And it's something that the Kenyan state is going to have to work with flower growers to try to devise a way to regulate it. So another drawback of these codes of ethics, of course, also is that they're dependent on consumer awareness and activism. So retailers don't necessarily drop these overnight, but they may scale some of them back in order to meet demand if consumers aren't constantly concerned about this and raising awareness of it is self-regulation. So we might see some of these things disappear. So what can we do to make floriculture work better for Kenya? So one thing, of course, is to continue this kind of pressure at the consumer end, maintaining consumer vigilance and pressure. We might be able to create place of origin labels so that flower growers in Naivasha that are doing a particularly good job can have credit for that on the market. Somebody could say, look for flowers grown in Naivasha if there is an understanding that that label connotates better working conditions or better treatment of the environment on those farms. And then also, of course, improving on-farm infrastructure, making sure that workers are living in housing that has been upgraded, that where they are comfortable, but they also have access to proper waste disposal, running water, et cetera, a functioning sewage treatment plant. And then in general, building the capacity of the Kenyan state to perform environmental regulatory functions. And so one of the things that I was really interested in while I was there is that there were these very interesting public-private partnerships that were in development between the flower industry and the Kenyan government to try and regulate the water resources that floriculture was dependent on. So water is really the limiting factor. If that water either runs out, you don't have enough of it, or if the water becomes so polluted that you can't irrigate your flowers with it without poisoning them, then you have a problem, right? All of your fixed assets in floriculture are wasted. That money is lost. So flower growers were very interested in working with the Kenyan government to try and create water permitting and water metering systems to make sure that no one was violating that, and to make sure that there was no effluent entering the water that would degrade the quality of it as well. So there were experiments in those kinds of things, and I'm watching them develop over time in my continuing work. However, they're not really at the point now where they're protecting those water resources adequately. So there's much more work to be done at that level as well. And so as a consumer, if you're interested in what it means to exert consumer pressure, there are lots of labels that you can use to tell whether or not a flower has been grown in an ethical way. So there are fair trade flowers from Kenya. Fair trade flowers are a little bit different than fair trade bananas or coffee, because most products like that are grown by smallholders that still live in a community near their farm. Remember that a lot of the farm workers that are coming to work on Kenyan farms are migrating from all over Kenya. They're no longer living near their home community. So when they get that price premium that you pay for a fair trade flower, when they're given that back, they usually use it for something in the housing settlement or they're on the farm. Less of that money ends up going back to the communities where they're from and contributing to rural development as directly as it does in some other industries. But there are some of these other labels that are homegrown that either come from the retailers or come from the Kenyan Flower Council, which is a local organization that kind of signal that those growers that have that label on their product are following a specific code of ethics. And so I am going to stop there. I've talked for 40 minutes, a little longer than I intended, because I'm sure you guys have lots and lots of questions about my work. So I will pause.
Okay, well, we now enter the question and answer portion of our evening. We will have about 20 minutes for the discussion. As in our previous wacky programs, we will use what they call the raise hand function in Zoom to facilitate the question and answer process. Now, to do so, you start by clicking on the participants tab, which appears maybe on different locations of your screen of the different attendee screens, but either in the lower left-hand corner or in the lower center part of the screen, I think you will see a tab called Participants. And what you do is you click on that, and then you will find your name in the list of attendees, and you will click on the raise hand button by, I think it's by your name. If you have a question, please click that button to raise your hand. And then Dr. Adriana Crocker will be moderating the discussion this evening. And once Dr. Crocker has called your name, you may unmute yourself and ask your question. Now, we ask that you ask only one question at a time. And then when your question has been answered, please mute yourself again, and we will then move on to the next person with a question. There you go.
Hi, how are you? Hi. Thank you, Dr. Stiles. That was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Crocker.
We have here a question from Louis von Bern. Am I pronouncing your name right? Louis?
I think his hand's actually been raised since before I started my presentation. I think it might have been an accidental hand raise.
Okay. So here we have some questions on the chat by David and Rita Anderson. How has the Kenyan flower economy contributed to raising the standard of living for the poor?
Yeah, it's a great question. And also, I'll have to give you a very complex answer, right? So definitely for the people that are coming and who get kind of more full-time permanent jobs within that industry, it does improve their lives to some extent. So they are able to send some of their wages home to their home communities, which contributes to rural development in that way. And they also borrow against their salaries, pay school fees, start businesses, try to buy land. However, as they describe that process, it's very slippery, right? It's very, many of them end up heavily indebted, having borrowed against their salary. And so much of their paycheck is garnered by those loans that they're living on very little in the end. Many of them make payments on land, but aren't necessarily able to finish making those payments, et cetera. So in Kenya, a little bit goes a long way, and people are absolutely desperate for these kinds of opportunities, which is why they're willing to sacrifice so much. And many of them describe themselves as having left a space of even greater vulnerability to come to Naivasha, where they're still very vulnerable. So certainly they view it as worth it to them to seek these opportunities and to do what they can with these very, very marginal gains. But in terms of sort of a trickling out and raising a standard of living for many, many people, it's kind of challenging. You know, it's piecemeal. It depends on whether or not you're able to really hold that employment for long enough to kind of actualize your aspirations. That's for the lowest paid workers. But for the middle class Kenyans, it has definitely contributed to this growing middle class in Africa and in Kenya, that a lot of them are able to find durable employment in the industry and really use this to grow their careers and their wealth as well.
Thank you. There is another question on the chat. It says, from Lisa Stone, what is the effort toward improving infrastructure in the area? If none, why not?
So there have been, yeah, it's a great question. There have been lots of efforts. A lot of it tends to focuses on the infrastructure that is needed to get the flowers to market, right? So when I first started working there in 2004, the roads around the lake were in horrible condition, in part because the flower trucks are very heavy. So the government wasn't necessarily able to afford to upgrade those roads, but the flower industry itself brought together a collection and ended up resurfacing those roads and continues to do that. And now there are many more forms of foreign investment in Kenya. So there are many Chinese companies, for instance, that have contracts to do those roads and upgrades. So there have been efforts to improve that infrastructure. Some things like the water sewage treatment, they've tried to build one in the past and it's failed. People ended up stealing all of the equipment. So there are also a lot of problems that come when development like this is concentrated in one area, and there are so many places surrounding that area that aren't benefiting from it, and a lot of those resources end up being kind of pulled apart and falling apart. So that kind of part of it is just a challenge of building an infrastructure that is durable and that really lasts without kind of that consistent investment.
Yeah, Dr. Bakir, Dr. Siddiq, if you want to ask a question.
Hello. Yes, my first question is a macro question. You showed that the cover page of the Economist magazine from 2016 saying, saying, what is it, blossoms of hope and success. So the question I have is in terms of this particular industry, the flower industry, over the last 40 years, what has been the growth rate of that industry in terms of the size of that sector in relation to the Kenya's GDP during that period? Could you tell us something about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I might not be able to give you the exact numbers right now, although I can email them to you later. But so part of the reason that it was seen by The Economist and others as sort of this blossoming success is that in contrast to traditional agricultural commodities in Kenya, which were continuing to kind of be devalued over time, non-traditional commodities like flowers and green beans were increasing, 10 to 20% annually in terms of their profitability. That kind of started to level out around 2007. There was a dip in 2008 when the volcano went off in Iceland and they couldn't get products to market. And then things were continuing to tick up until now. And now the bottom has dropped out of the industry because most of the people who are buying these flowers in Europe are in lockdown and are not buying flowers, aren't going to people's houses. So they are really subject to kind of these crises at the global level. But apart from the Icelandic volcano and the coronavirus, it was sort of ticking upward. It started to plateau, but it had been continually growing in profitability, and Kenya was getting a larger and larger market share. I think it's probably reached its maximum point of growth at this point, and now we might see some more consolidation in this industry with just a few larger companies sort of controlling the market share and some of the smaller players dropping out. So I think it's probably gotten about as big as it can be now. If that kind of answers your question. And in terms of percentage of GDP, I can tell you I don't have that figure available, but it toggles between the third and fourth largest earner of foreign exchange in Kenya, and that's not just flowers, but the fresh horticulture industry, which includes flowers and also other fresh vegetables that are among those non-traditional agricultural commodities. Then one of the third or fourth is usually tourism, which is also really impacted by geopolitical events.
Thank you.
Here is Tony Florian. Can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, my question relates to the growing season in Kenya of flowers. Are there multiple growing seasons? And if so, is the industry able to take advantage of that, the fact that it has multiple growing seasons?
Yeah, that's a great question. So part of the reason that it's so lucrative to grow flowers in Kenya is because this is an equatorial climate, and so they're able to grow them year round, and they don't need to artificially heat the greenhouses. And then they have a perfect 12 hours of daylight, so they don't have to artificially light them as well. So part of the reasons that this industry really took off is because of those particular growing conditions, and then also, of course, the very low labor costs that are involved. They're paying people very little, and then they're able to sell these in euros or in pounds, etc. So yeah, it's one growing season year round in greenhouses.
Very good, thank you.
There is another question from Sue Massey. Who owns the flower farms? Are they Kenyans? Are they concerned about workers?
Yeah, so this is also a really good question. So it varies. So the largest, most successful flower farms in the Naivasha area at the time that I was doing my research, one was owned by a naturalized Dutch Kenyan, so someone who had been in Kenya since the 1960s, made his fortune in the agricultural chemical industry, and then bought land near Naivasha and ended up starting a successful flower farm. So he was a Kenyan citizen, but he was of Dutch origin. And then the other largest flower farm was actually a transnational corporation owned by Dutch investors entirely, and that was sold while I was in the field to a Bangalore-based transnational corporation that has since that farm has since folded. And then the third largest farm was actually owned by a white Kenyan family, Osarian, and that's the most successful flower farm and largest flower farm in Kenya to date. So a lot of them have, even if people are naturalized citizens, they're white Kenyans, or they have connections to commercial outlets in Europe, because it took an incredible kind of commercial savvy to get these off the ground and build the markets for them. That's the biggest ones. There are a lot of mid-sized Kenyan farms that are at least partially owned by Black Kenyan investors. And as is the case with many Kenyan companies, there's usually a politically influential or fairly wealthy Kenyan investor who is at least a silent partner in most of these enterprises. So some of the mid-sized and smaller farms are owned by Kenyans. A lot of the other ones are owned by white Kenyans or are transnational companies at this point.
And here's a question by a student, Julia Wasik. Is there an ethical response effort towards addressing the sexual harassment the mainly female workforce experience? In addition, what demographic of women are working with the flowers? Is it mixed, or are they mainly young women, young mothers, middle-aged, older?
Yeah, this is a great question, Julia. Hi. So, okay, so let me think. So let me start with who the women are that are. Let me start with who the women are who are working in the industry. So a lot of them are very young to start with, because this is the heat within these greenhouses is really difficult to withstand. People are on their feet for hours and hours a day. So it does sort of skew younger. However, when I was there doing my research, there were lots of people that had some people who had been permanent employees at these farms for decades. So there was also sort of a smaller group of people who had managed to have consistent employment in the industry with some of the really big farms that had been there for decades. And then as they aged, they were kind of put into positions that were a little bit less physically taxing. So one of the workers that I profile in one of the chapters of my book, for instance, is a woman who, by the time she retired, was just washing buckets. So 15 years ago, she was working in a pack house, but then by the time she retired, she was washing buckets. So doing something less physically intensive. But there's turnover in the industry, and it is very physically taxing. So I would say that it's probably people between the ages of 18 and their early 30s that are most heavily represented. And then in terms of sexual harassment, there has been, a lot of the codes of ethics are really focused on the fact that it is mainly women who are working in the industry, and so they've tried to do things to try to limit their vulnerability to things like sexual harassment. Although it is kind of difficult, it is a very patriarchal society, and when I would talk to the women about when they experienced this the most, it was mainly when they were trying to get a job, the things that might have to be done to get a job. But then once they were then in the position, there was a little bit more oversight by management, et cetera, and they had access to the worker welfare organizations and et cetera. So they were maybe a little less vulnerable at that point in their career. But it is a perennial issue, although some of the codes of ethics are focused on trying to kind of address those problems. And the farm, to answer a question that was in one of those other questions that I had left out, are the managers concerned about workers? Yes, they are concerned about workers. As I said, almost everybody is kind of concerned about the industry's reputation as exploitative. So they are concerned about the workers, and there are efforts to try to address some of these things. But as I describe in their book, they're often very, very awkward and very incomplete.
Here's another question on the chat. Do you know how the Colombia to USA market compares to the Kenya to Europe market?
So I'm not sure if that's in terms of like labor conditions in the industry. There are some pretty good books and documentaries about labor conditions on the farms in Colombia and Ecuador. Um, but in terms of the size, one thing that is really interesting to think about, I need to look this statistic up again, but it's the comparison is something like the country of Switzerland buys more flowers in 3 months than all of the United States does in a year. So the market for these flowers in Europe is just much larger than it is here because they just have so many more cultural traditions that flowers are sort of wrapped up into, whereas we have just a few holidays and kind of special occasions where we give these flowers. So I hope that kind of starts to get at your question. The history of labor in Colombia and Ecuador is also very interesting. A lot of the same issues, especially in terms of women's issues, but also a lot, deeper history of labor activism in Colombia and Ecuador that also shapes the outcomes for women in ways that are pretty profoundly different from what we see for women on these flower farms in Kenya as well.
Dr. Siddiq, you have your hand raised.
Yes, this question is more micro level about the market structure there. The first part is about the labor. Other workers allowed to form unions? Are they? That's one part, first part, and then second part is about the producers. How many are there, and what the structure is? That more like a sort of monopoly or oligopolistic type market structure there? And then related to that is the questions about the banking. You said, I was curious about that, the loan business that these producers are in. Why isn't it the banking sector doing that? Why is it that the producers themselves are engaged in this activity? I say that because I know in the carpet industry in South Asian context, and that's a sign of bonded labor kind of thing. You know what I mean by that, right? Because yeah.
So, okay, let me try to get all those. I think I'm going to answer the banking questions first. So one of the things that is interesting is it's not necessarily the farms themselves that are providing the financing for the loans. They allow the workers to form like self-help credit unions. So in a sense, and then they hold that money for the workers. So it's sort of self-organized, and the farm doesn't necessarily have to take on any of the risk of that. They collect it through the paychecks, and they watch the interest and organize it. But it's sort of a more like a credit union kind of setup where the workers themselves are also the owners of the bank as well. And then so that can be difficult. Although one of the things that I thought was really interesting is, why do the workers stay and pay off their debt, right? What is it that holds people there? There's really interesting kind of economic anthropology questions around that, because they could conceivably just leave. So I hope that starts to answer that question. There is a banking sector. It can be difficult for people to get, formal bank accounts in Kenya. A lot of this is organized through these kind of credit union setups, and the farms just kind of manage it. Then I might have lost the other two questions. Let me see if I can remember. One is about what the structure of the sector looks like. So in the time that I've been working there since 2004, it's become more and more consolidated. So because initially there was a lot of kind of development investment to kind of help floriculture grow in a way that other green beans and other fresh vegetables had grown, where they thought they could just kind of set people up and help them learn to grow these flowers. But the roses especially are incredibly capital intensive. They have to lease these rose bush varieties from these Dutch growers that develop them. They're very costly. The roses are incredibly perishable. So if something goes wrong and you can't get them to market very quickly, you lose your entire crop. So it's just much harder for smallholders to stay viable in that industry than it was with something like green beans or a food crop. And they also couldn't sell them on the local market if they started to go bad, right? Because there wasn't a local market for Kenyan flowers. So over time, a lot of the smaller flower growers, if they've survived, they're outgrowers for the big ones. So for the big companies that have these supermarket contracts and have the direct relationships with the auctions, they might produce an entire bouquet and they may grow 70% of the flowers, and they might contract with a smaller outgrower to grow some of the other specialty varieties. So that's how that tends to work. And that consolidation also, they're kind of vertically and horizontally integrated, the bigger farms, because so for instance, Osarian also owns the online auction system that is used to sell a lot of the flowers. So even other growers will have to go through Osarian's subsidiary business to get their product to market. I think I lost the other question, the first one.
Union.
The union. Yes, this is a really good question. So yes, unions are legal in Kenya. They are not especially strong. So out of the farms that I was working on, there was one farm that was fully unionized. All of the other farms, the workers were kind of covered by these welfare officers that were part of the codes of ethics that they were signed on to with retailers. And that was really interesting because I talked to the workers themselves about the union and the power of the union. Would you like to unionize? And there was sort of some of them felt like the union was really, working for them to get better conditions. Some of them viewed the union as very corrupt and preferred the welfare organization. There was sort of not a strong kind of a collective labor organization within floriculture, although there were people trying to establish that.
There's one more question from Julia. She's asking, are there any notable experiences you had while interviewing and relationship building with the people? Did you get any new insights about people or about Kenyan people in general that you may not have expected before?
So I think that that's a good question to encourage you to read my book, because the entire book is about my relationships with the people with whom I worked and lived. So when I did the bulk of my research, I lived there for a year. And so I try in my work, I try to bring forth the voices of the people that I was working with, so that it's not sort of all written from me sort of summarizing everything. There are many interludes in the book where I talk about the perspective of individual actors as sort of examples of what people were thinking and feeling in relation to the industry. And those were all people that I became very close to and remain very close to today. It's easier to keep in touch with people because everyone in Kenya has lots of people, no matter how poor they are, have phones and have smartphones and maybe on Facebook. So I'm able now to keep in touch with a lot of people through Facebook and WhatsApp and those kinds of things as well. So still in touch with them, very profound relationships, and a lot of them are really profiled in the book.
And one more question from Grace Wentz.
Hi, it's actually Peter.
It's actually, yeah, I know your wife's name.
But I'm curious about the lake that is crucial to this operation. Its level is going down, and related questions about that. First, just like the Oglala aquifer, in our country, farming practices will have to change in the next 50 years or so. Is there a limit of the same sort regarding the flower industry? And also, what are the broader environmental consequences on other species of the lake being diminished? So how is it going to run out? And what's happening?
Yeah, so those are excellent questions. And that was sort of a central focus of my work too, that I didn't really present in the lecture so far. So thank you for that question. So the quality, the ecological integrity of the lake has really degraded even in the time that I've been working there. And a lot of that is because of kind of this rapid, unplanned urban development. If you talk to the ecologists that are studying the lake, they'll say that there are a couple really critical turning points and things that are really driving that. And one of them is the clearance of vegetation, especially the papyrus around the lake shore. So the removal of that vegetation means that it's less protected when there are all of these pollutants that are running in during a rain event, et cetera. And then also, long before floriculture in the 1970s, there were several introductions of invasive species, alien species to the lake. So someone introduced crayfish to try to create sort of a food a food product for local people, and those crayfish end up eating a lot of the macrophytes and stirring up soil and creating a much muddier lake, which makes it more difficult for some of the other fish in the lake to survive. Tilapia were introduced, and then bass were introduced as a sport fish. And all of those things are that fishery is still kind of functional within the lake, but the introduction of freshwater hyacinth and crayfish, and then the clearing of the papyrus around the lake, not just for floriculture, but for other kind of development and settlement, have caused major issues. And then in terms of the water, is there a limiting factor? Yes, there definitely would be a moment where so much of the water would be abstracted that things would become really problematic. But ironically, it's not floriculture that's pushing Naivasha closer to that edge right now. So in the time that I've been working there, the World Bank and many foreign investors have invested heavily in geothermal development in the Rift Valley in Ethiopia and in Kenya. And so there had been geothermal power production since the 1980s. In Kenya, there's been a successful geothermal power plant there, but now geothermal development has exploded. And so geothermal power is actually the largest water user in the lake at the moment. And all of these regulatory processes that I'd been studying that were all entirely focused on floriculture, right? So they were really all about how we're going to get the flower farmers around the lake to cooperate and monitor their water use. And the geothermal industry is not at the table when it comes to those regulatory processes. So I would predict that water use by geothermal power is the thing that is a much bigger threat to the lake right now than the water that's being pumped from floriculture. And floriculture may actually be one of the few things standing in the way of the total, demise of the lake, right? Because they still need the water quality in a way that geothermal doesn't.
Thanks.
Yeah, long answer, sorry.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. We have one more question from Tony Florian, and then that will be it. Okay, thank you.
Okay. I have a question regarding the nature of the plant stock that's used for growing these flowers. Were they locally developed or were they all imported? And are the plants themselves in pots that are shipped to Kenya ready to go? Or is there a local industry that has developed?
So that's a great question. So one of the things that I think is really fascinating about the Kenyan flower industry is that the majority of these rose varieties, for instance, are created in Holland, right? Those breeds are sort of created there. And then the flower growers license them as agricultural technologies. But over the years, flower growers have those Dutch producers of those varieties have established farms in Kenya to develop varieties that will grow better there. And then the rose farmers have been a part of kind of that process of developing the rose varieties that grow best in the Kenyan conditions. So it's kind of a hybrid that these things are really kind of developed and licensed by these companies outside of Kenya, but they rely heavily on these subsidiaries in Kenya that have helped to develop better breeds that grow in these particular growing environments. And that's just the roses. There are lots of other varieties that are grown there as well, but none of these are native plants, of course. They're all coming from elsewhere. And there's an incredible kind of economy surrounding those as well. It's really expensive to license those. If that answered your question, Tony, did that answer your question?
Well, also, how are they planted? Are they in pots?
Yes.
They are.
Yeah, no, so they're in raised beds. So they're not planted directly in the ground. They're in raised beds, and then they're either grown in cocoa or pumice. The local volcanic rock as a growing medium. And so that's kind of fun when they grow it in the pumice, because then they occasionally can use steam heat to remove any microbes, etc., and clean that pumice, and then plant again. So it's all raised bed agriculture.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stiles. Bruce? You're muted.
Okay, sorry about that. Well, I want to say on behalf of all of our participants tonight, thank you, Dr. Stiles, for a very clear and complete explanation of the floral industry over in Kenya. I mean, And the question and the answers were quite informative and complete too. Thanks to everybody for asking the questions. They seem to be very relevant to the whole issue and helping us all understand what's going on over there. I want to say, yeah, thank you, Dr. Stiles. But I also want to say thank you to all of you that are attending our program tonight. And I know many of you have participated in our listening to our programs previously. Our next program will be in February. We are in the process of working on 4 programs for next spring, February, March, April, and May. Our next one will be in February, and it will be in collaboration with the SIU School of Medicine. So put that in your calendar. We'll get you a date and a specific topic fairly soon, I think. I'd like to invite you to consider, if you are not currently a member of WACI, to invite you to become a member. WACI is a nonprofit volunteer organization, and the membership contributions allow us to pay the expenses required for these programs. So it's just something to think about. And if you go to our website, there is membership information, and you'll be able to find your way into becoming a formal member of the organization, and we'd love to have you. So with that, I will say good night to everybody. And again, thank you for participating in the program. Good
And
night.
thank you all for having me and for fantastic questions. That was really fun.
Thank you so much.